about 5 or 6 years ago, I don't remember exactly, I was driving toward Owosso. I was on 52, and I have mentioned this before, but I don't have road rage, but I tend to get angry when I drive if people do stupid things. So there are plenty of opportunities for me to get angry. But what I'm about to tell you, I'm not at all proud of it. It's probably the worst I had ever been. But I'm driving toward Owosso on 52. I'm in a spot where you can't pass. It's a solid line. And this guy in pickup truck is coming up behind me, and he's coming in hot. And like I could just see it in his eyes. It was daytime, and he was just fuming. Because, I was going 55, and this guy was so upset, and he was trying to get over to pass me. And I knew what he was going to do even before he did it. We were in a no passing zone, but I could see up ahead things he couldn't, and I knew there were cars coming, and yet it looked like he had a spot where he could get by me, even though he shouldn't. And so he came up beside me, and as soon as he got beside me, there was a car coming toward him, and I had a split-second decision to make. Should I let this idiot get in this car crash, or should I slow down and let him over? And so I slammed on my brakes so he could get over, and he avoided that car collision, which I probably would have been involved in too. But when that happened, so this guy is ahead of me now, I got angry. I popped a cork. I really did. I'm just telling you, I did. So here's a guy in a pickup truck with a gun rack. I see the gun rack on his inside. And Pastor Chris, in a little Chevy Cruze, decides to go after this guy. And I did. I followed him. I followed him to Bennington Road. He turned left on Bennington Road. I kept following him. I didn't know what I was going to do if I caught up with him. But I was angry. I had lost control of myself. And let me tell you why. So this is the honest truth. Whenever things like that happen, especially at that time, because at that time my daughter had just started driving, and she's a good driver, but I knew that if there had been an inexperienced driver who wasn't putting all these pieces together out of many, many years of flawless driving, if it were an inexperienced driver like maybe my daughter, I don't know how that would have ended. Seriously. And I was replaying that in my mind, and I lost control of myself. And I was following this guy, going way too fast. And but somehow God got hold of me. I was able to take the exit ramp off of my anger and realize, Chris, you're a moron. You need to stop this right now. And I'm pretty sure that God called me a moron. Can God call a person a moron? I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that's what he said to me. Well, I tell you this story because as we finish up this series on emotions, I want to talk about an emotion and a feeling this morning of anger. And as we've been saying in this series, kind of we grow up sometimes with these understandings that, if we're feeling a certain way that's not good, we should just stop. And you let people tell you, well, stop. Stop being angry. Stop being depressed. Stop. Whatever it is, just turn it off and stop. And yet we know for many of us that sort of philosophy hasn't worked very well. And so what we have been talking about is that it's not so much the feelings that we feel or the emotions that pass through us, but it's what we do with them. Well, where they take us. We said that the word emotion is derived from two words actually, that just means it's going to take you somewhere. It's going to go somewhere. Where are those feelings taking me? They're driving us somewhere. They're moving us somewhere. And so the question is, where are these feelings? Where are they? Like if you play it out, where are they taking us? And so we've been talking about these different emotions in a way that hopefully allows us, when we have them, to grow closer toward God and not farther away from God. And the one emotion, again, anger, that I want to talk about this morning, it has been called in many ways, Dr. John Gottman described anger as sort of the iceberg emotion. Because it often, if you look at an iceberg that's sticking up out of the water, that's the anger. But yet there's usually a lot of underlying feelings and emotions that are surfacing as anger. I said particularly a couple weeks ago that most generally men, when men display the emotion of sadness, it's usually coming out, or anger, it's usually coming out of a place of sadness. And so I want to talk about that this morning, about anger and resentment and all of these things that can drive us in a direction that is not very good to go. So as we've been sort of looking at this, we've taken different Psalms from David. David was a man who wrote extensively about his feelings, about his emotions, and he had all of them throughout his life. And so we've looked at different Psalms. The one I want to take out today is Psalm 109. Psalm 109. This is sort of a grouping of psalms that are often called the imprecatory psalms. The imprecatory psalms. Imprecatory, just a word meaning curses. And in this psalm and others like it, David is just venting his anger and his rage. He's not doing it specifically in this psalm toward God, but there are some that are toward God, that we can even be angry toward God, and God understands that. But yet the question is, again, where is this taking us? And so Psalm 109, verse 8, David is talking to God about this enemy that he has, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But here's how this psalm goes. About verse 8, it says, God, let his years be few, this enemy, whoever it is. Let someone else take his position. May his children become fatherless and his wife a widow. May his children wander as beggars and be driven from their ruined homes. May creditors seize his entire estate and strangers take all that he has earned. Let no one be kind to him. Let no one pity his fatherless children. May all his offspring die. He's kind of angry, right? He's a little bit angry. His prayer, I hope he dies. I hope he loses his job. I hope his kids suffer. I hope his legacy is nothing. I hope his kids have no friends. I hope his kids die. In Jesus' name, amen. That's, basically, I don't remember, I don't know about you, but I don't remember learning to pray that way, right? We pray maybe the 23rd Psalm. We talked about that last week. David goes from resting in green meadows and still waters to I hope everything about this guy is horrible. David's angry. Now, one of the interesting things that we need to take note of is that David was a warrior. David traveled with an army. David, when he wrote Psalm 109, he was a king. All of these things that he sort of vented in the psalm, he could have done. He could have either done himself or he could have had these done, but yet he didn't. And so what he's doing in this psalm is he's just talking to God about his feelings. God, I am so angry at this person that it would be just justice if all of this stuff happened to him. And so this is where he's at in Psalm 109. And there might be some debate about this, but most scholars believe that sort of the guy he's got on his mind is this guy named Nabal. So we're going to talk about Nabal. And this story comes from 1 Samuel 25. And so we're going to be in 1 Samuel 25 as well as Psalm 109. A few of the verses I'll have on the screen. But it's kind of an intricate story. So I really need you this Sunday to stay awake. Don't make me angry, and I won't see you nodding off, but I promise you that you're going to want to stay awake for this. But in 1 Samuel 25, we read about this guy Nabal, and David, this is before David was a king, and he's wandering from cave to cave, but he's rolling with about 600 men. David's his warriors, his mighty men. And they're living off the land. They're off the grid because King Saul has it out for David. And so this is where he meets this guy Nabal in 1 Samuel 25 and verse 2. It says, a certain man in Maon who had property there at Carmel was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats, 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail, and she was intelligent. She was a beautiful woman, but her husband was surly and mean in his dealings. Actually, the name Nabal means fool. So that's who he was. He was foolish and angry and harsh and dishonest and manipulative, not a nice person. So when David was in the wilderness, he heard that Nabal was shearing the sheep. So David sent 10 young men to them and said, Go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. And say to him, Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. Now I hear that at sheep shearing time, when your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your servants, and they will tell you. Therefore, be favorable toward my men, since we have come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them to eat. So they're hungry. They're asking this guy. They helped him out by looking after his stuff, and they're asking him for food to eat. And so David, as a matter, very respectful and humble, and they're like, "Hey, we've been good neighbors. Nothing's missing. Got 600 warriors here, and they're all like we're all it's like hangry." Like, does anybody get hangry? You're so hungry you get angry. I saw a couple of hands. Said, we've never had rack of lamb. We never took one of your sheep. In fact, we protected your flock. So please, anything you have to spare for us to eat, we'd really appreciate it. And verse 9 says, when David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name. And then they waited. And Nabal answered David's servants. Who is this David? He said. Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their master these days. Why should I take my bread and water and the meat I have slaughtered for my shears and give it to these men coming from who knows where? Now listen, Nabal, this guy knew exactly who David is. But he not only rejects David, but he does it in just this offensive, demeaning way. And he may be used to treating people like this, Nabal, but David was not used to being treated like this. And so something is going to happen here. Verse 12 says, David's men turned around, went back, and when they arrived, they reported every word David said to these men. David said, strap on your swords, and so they did. David strapped on his as well, and about 400 of them went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. So David here, like he is angry. Like he's not driving, but he's got like road rage, right? He is headed somewhere, and he is angry. And you might have heard that psychologists will talk about kind of 4 levels of anger that have been identified. I think I mentioned these a few weeks ago, but the first level would be annoyance, like we're just really annoyed at something. That would lead to frustration, and then just outright hostility, and then rage. And rage is that point where you've kind of lost your ability to make rational decisions, and you're just on the verge of doing something really, really stupid. And I'm guessing David, like even before any of this happened, was hovering somewhere between frustration and hostility. I mean, he's living with 6,000 men in the wilderness, and so he was probably a little bit on edge already. And then this happens, and now he's at level 4, and he's at the strap on your sword level, I guess. And he's just not thinking straight, and he's going to go do something. So David is angry. Now the Bible doesn't say it's a sin to feel angry. I don't know if you're aware of that or not. Bible does say it's that we can sin in our anger. It doesn't say don't be angry, but it says in your anger do not sin. And so to avoid going from anger to sin, there are a couple sort of exit ramps or crossroads we come to. And the first one of those would be a question you can ask yourself: Am I going to react to this, or am I going to respond? You feel your temperature rising, and so one of the questions you ask yourself: Am I going to just react to this, or am I going to respond? And David reacts. Like as soon as he hears this, he immediately reacts and he says, guys, strap on your swords, we're going. And so David expresses his anger in a way that's really, really aggressive. He's overheating, and that's where I was that day, and maybe some of you have experienced that as well. You just are sometimes identified by your anger. And by the way, this wasn't a unique incident. This was the worst. But I get angry when people do stupid things. I do. It makes me angry is what it does. And so, but we've got choices to make. And some of you kind of are like that, like in other areas, and just sort of that's kind of how you are. Maybe you don't act aggressive. Maybe it doesn't mean you're an angry person. Maybe you might be kind of the what we call passive aggressive. Like you're not outwardly angry, but you just hold your affection, you withhold your attention, you withhold encouragement from people, and you're just sort of passive aggressive. And this tends to be oftentimes the favorite approach of Christians, Because you can be mean to somebody with a smile on your face, right? And then if they accuse you of being passive aggressive, you have plausible deniability because you're not showing it. And so that's the favorite way of Christians oftentimes to be aggressive and angry, but it's still wrong. I've learned, I don't know about you, but I've learned to sort of pay attention to some of the passive aggressive things people say before they get mean. And one of my favorites, probably the most common one, is this: hey, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but, right? Have you ever heard that? Hey, don't take this the wrong way. And when somebody says that to you, that you're gonna take it the wrong way, and somebody says that to you, and hey, don't take this the wrong way, and you want to say back to them, well, okay, don't take this the wrong way before you lay it on them. But there are all kinds of things we say when we're being passive aggressive, and it's just another way that people can be angry. People oftentimes get sarcastic instead of angry. So there's all kinds of ways that this sort of comes out. There are other people that kind of stonewall. They just go totally silent. They shut somebody out. They ignore somebody. They give them the silent treatment. And in many ways, and oftentimes in the context of a marriage, this is one of the cruelest things that a person can do in their state of anger. You don't yell. You don't scream. You just sort of act as if the other person doesn't exist. But David here, he reacts. Strap on your swords, boys. We're going to go after them. And so the question is, am I going to react, or am I going to thoughtfully, am I going to respond? Again, the message of Scripture is not no anger, but it's slow anger. Think about things. The book of James, Jesus' brother, said everybody ought to be quick to listen, but slow to speak and slow to become angry. Right? And you say, well, Chris, what about Jesus in the temple? Jesus just one day goes in the temple, and yeah, it was a mess, the things they were doing in there, but Jesus flipped his lid. He flipped over the money changers' tables. He had a whip. He was yelling, screaming. He just sort of flipped out. That's what Jesus did. Well, that's not really exactly what Jesus did. Many times we forget that the Bible says that Jesus, the night before that incident, went into the temple, and he just looked around. He just took it all in. And so he thoughtfully responded, okay, how can I best deal with this horrible situation? And so I'm sure after a lot of thought that night in prayer, that's when he went into the temple the next day and said, my father's not happy with the situation, guy. No, he went crazy almost, right? But he didn't just react. He responded. David and 400 of his men are armed. They're headed for Nabal. And then in verse 14, meanwhile, we read this. One of the servants told Abigail, Nabal's wife, hey, David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings. But our master hurled insults at them. Yet these men, David's men, they were very good to us. They didn't mistreat us. The whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing was missing. Night and day, they were a wall around us the whole time we were herding our sheep near them. Now think it over and see what you can do, Abigail, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household, and he is such a wicked man. Listen, no one can talk to him. No one can talk to him. And that's the problem with people who sort of are perennially angry, that there are people that care about them and love them and want to talk to them, but they don't feel like they can. They don't feel like they can talk to you because you're too sensitive, and you'll get angry. And you overreact, and you think, well, I've never heard of such a thing. Nobody's ever told me that I'm sensitive and overreact. Yeah, because they're afraid to tell you that, because you're going to overreact, right? And yet this was evidently the situation. It says nobody dared tell him the way it was. That's what was happening here with Nabal. So Abigail seems to know how David's going to respond to her husband. And so in verse 18, it says, Abigail acted quickly. She took, I love this, she's brilliant. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisin, 200 cakes of pressed figs, loaded them on donkeys, and then she told her servants, go on ahead, I'll follow you. But she didn't tell her husband Nabal any of this. So she's doing something, the only way that she knows to prevent a disaster from happening. And so this is what she does, and she's brilliant. She sends her servants ahead with food, and it's a really good decision. She probably threw some Chick-fil-A in there because that helps everybody be in a better mood, right? And so let's at least feed them. So they may be angry, but they're not hangry now. And so let's give them some food. So verse 20, as she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there was David and his men descending toward her. And she met them, and David had just said, hey, it's been useless. All my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness, everything that we did for them, that was nothing for him, because this is how he pays us back. And so this is sort of why David is angry in a sense, because it's not right, it's not justice, it's not fair. And so we see in the Bible over and over again that many times anger comes as a result of something not being just or injustice, or somebody taking advantage of somebody else. So the Bible would talk to us about what we call a righteous anger, where there are things in this world that we ought to be angry about. There are things in this world that just are not right. And so there's an aspect of righteousness that a key part of that ought to involve at times some profound anger. But here's the difference. It's not getting angry when we are personally offended. We can get angry at injustice of something happening to somebody else, but we don't get angry at something that only happens to us and involves us. If you think again about Jesus, he got angry frequently. He got angry at how other people were treated, though he never got angry and lashed out because of how he was being treated. In fact, it was the very opposite, wasn't it? Like when we're personally mistreated, and it may be right, like whatever that person did to us or said against us isn't right. We can feel those feelings of anger, but again, where are they moving us to? Are they moving us closer to God or farther away from him into doing something that we should never do or saying something that we should never say? Jesus got angry, but only at the mistreatment of other people. And I think when it comes down to it, for all of us, this is just such a key aspect of maturity, spiritual maturity is in our anger. Are we angry because somebody has slighted us or somebody has offended us or somebody has insulted us or whatever it might be? Or are we angry because of the way others are treated and things that happen to other people? Like this is a key thing we need to ask ourselves. In any event, Abigail comes upon David, and as he's kind of just rehearsing in his mind what has been done to him, verse 23, when Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and she bowed down before David with her face to the ground. So what's she doing here? She's humbling herself to him. And what she's doing is really, really hard to do when somebody in your life is overreacting. Did you humble yourself? Like she's not the idiot, all right? Her husband is. No comment, but she is humbling herself, right? And that's hard to do. Verse 24 says, she fell at his feet and said, my point with that little aside was, you understand the husband is the one who's being the idiot. See, I needed to explain that because so often that's not the case, right? So I just want to make sure you caught that nuance in the story, all right? Verse 24, she fell at his feet and said, pardon your servant, my Lord, and let me speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. Please pay no attention, my Lord, to that wicked man Nabal, my husband, for he is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. And so what she's saying to David, she's saying, please, David, don't react to him. He's a fool. She goes on to verse 28, and what she says again is just really brilliant because she wants to help David see the bigger picture. David is angry. He maybe has reached the level of rage, and he's kind of losing sight of perspective, and so she helps him to see what is at stake here, that this, whatever he decided to do, has the possibility of affecting the rest of his life. See, that's where rage and anger move us. It moves us to do things and to say things that perhaps will affect the rest of our lives, perhaps even endanger our lives. And so she says in verse 28, David, the Lord your God will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my Lord because you fight the Lord's battles. And no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. And then she says in verse 31, don't let this be a blemish on your record. Then your conscience won't have to bear the staggering burden of needless bloodshed and vengeance. And so another sort of question to ask yourself at the crossroads or an off-ramp in the vehicle of anger is, am I going to rehearse this thing, or am I going to stop and reflect and think about why I feel the way I do? Am I going to just keep replaying it in my mind and getting angrier and angrier, like you've got it on a hard drive and you just keep playing it over and over? You put it on a loop because you feel like if you forget what this person did or said to you, then that means that you forgive them. And that's really not the case. But that's what we tend to do, isn't it? And you know we do. Probably 90% of you do. There are 10% of you that are a lot better than the rest of us. But the 85 to 90% of us, we replay things in our minds, and we tend to get angrier and angrier about it, don't we? And so we got to ask ourselves the question, am I going to keep replaying this in my mind, or am I going to sort of stop and reflect, why in the world is this making me so angry? See, David, we find him, he's just going over it and going over it. This is what this man did to me. And he keeps replaying in his mind and he's rehearsing it. And so what Abigail is doing is she's asking him to stop and reflect on the consequences of where this will ultimately take you, this course of action that you've put into play. And so she said, David, just stop and think about why you're feeling this way. I understand why you're angry, but you've got an army with you. You're going to wipe out this guy and everything he owns, like with your whole army, this one guy. That's just not really smart. And so maybe it has to do with the fact that David was so angry, the fact that King Saul was pursuing him, chasing him around the wilderness. And so maybe as he thinks about it, David is frustrated more with King Saul, but he can't act on that anger, right? Because Saul is a king. And so he's going to transfer his anger from King Saul to this little guy Nabal, right? That's transference of anger, and we do that all the time. And so we need to stop and ask ourselves, am I really angry at this person, or is there someone else? Is there someone else? Something I've become painfully aware of in recent years is that I tend to do this. Like I'll be angry or upset about something or someone, and I'll kind of act angry or come off sounding angry toward my wife. And yet one day, because I'm a pastor and I'm so sensitive and in touch with my feelings, I finally realized that I was transferring it. I became more in tune with I realized it because Lori told me one day, don't yell at me about it. It's not my fault. Right? And she was absolutely right. Back to Psalm 109, David goes on this rant. He's just so angry about this enemy, but there's this little verse in that prayer where he's vulnerable, and it's verse 22 at the end of Psalm 109, where he says to God, "For I am poor and needy, and my heart is full of pain." See, that's the thing about an angry person. They may not know it, and oftentimes their anger is coming from hurt. And you've heard that expression, hurt people, right? People who are hurting often in turn hurt other people. And it's kind of a cliche, but I'm going to tell you it's true. Like it is so true. Their heart is usually full of pain. So just stop, reflect, ask yourself, why am I feeling this way? Where is this coming from? Am I directing this at the right person? And commit this process to God as you pray. Another thing Abigail does is that she brings God into the conversation 7 times. And so she speaks of God's plan, God's protection. For example, in verse 29, I love this. She says to David, even when you are chased by those who seek to kill you, your life is safe in the care of the Lord your God, secure in his treasure pouch. You're in his safe. But the lives of our enemies will disappear like stones shot from a sling, stones shot from a sling. You see what she's doing here? She's reminding David that, David, remember when you were up against this horrible giant and you had a righteous anger because of what this giant was doing? You just took a stone and you put him down with the sling because God was protecting with you. David, don't ever forget that God is with you. So there's a third crossroad or off-ramp we need to consider when we're at this stage is, am I going to keep raging? Am I going to keep allowing this anger to grow? Or am I going to release this and give it over to God? Now, when I say release it, it doesn't mean that you just kind of let it go into some sort of mystical abyss of bad feelings. No, you release it to God. You say to God, here's how I want to react. Here's how I want to respond. God, I'm so angry at this person that they did that or this person said that. I am so angry, God, but I know that I need to let this go because it's going to take me farther away from you, and I know I need to let it go. So the story ends kind of in verse 32. David says to Abigail, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands." Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought to him and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words. I have granted your request. I'm not going to kill your idiot husband." And she goes home. And yet when she goes home, there's a party going on. Her husband Nabal, he's completely wasted. And so she doesn't tell him what happened. But then it says in verse 37, in the morning, Nabal sobered up. His wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him, and he became like stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal down, and he died. And when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Praise the Lord," right? "Praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong. He has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head." And then David sent word to Abigail, asking her to become his wife. And his servants went to Carmel and said to Abigail, "David has sent us to take you to become his wife." And verse 42, Abigail very quickly got on the donkey and became his wife. Now that's a whole other issue we could talk about with David's many wives, but we're not going to go there this time. But the bottom line, it was a different time. But David is out of alignment. David's overheating. He's overreacting. But what happens? God uses Abigail to help David. And I got to say, I'm just saying this without trying to overstate it. I'm not trying to be humorous, but I really believe that guys, God puts our wives or maybe our mothers even in our lives to speak wisdom to us. And I think more often than not, I'm pretty sure that we need to listen to them probably more than we do. But David is out of alignment here. But Abigail gets him to just kind of just stop and take a little minute and think about what's going on. And so David releases it to the Lord. He takes that off ramp. He releases his anger. And by the end of Psalm 109, he's not angry. Verse 30 of Psalm 109 says, "But I will give repeated thanks to the Lord, praising him to everyone, for he stands beside me. He stands beside the needy, ready to save them from those who condemn them." And in this prayer, David moves from anger and rage to worship because he surrenders his emotions. He surrenders his anger over to God. Man, I love the way this story ends. The problem is that that's not the last story of David's life. David evidently must have struggled with this his entire life. He got off the rage road on this incident. But there was another incident. David struggled with anger his whole life. There was another time after David did become king. On one of the worst days of David's life, his son Absalom had led an insurrection, a coup against him and his own son. And so there's this incident where David is fleeing the city. Right, because his son has gone crazy and David's fleeing the city. And as David is exiting the city, there's this little twerp on the side of the road named Shimei. And Shimei is throwing stones at David. He's cursing David. He's taunting him. He's making fun of him. David's men were just incensed. They're like David, let's take this guy out. David's, no, we don't have time for that. God will deal with him. I'm not gonna take out vengeance. Well, that would sound great too. But David, many, many years later, he's on his deathbed. And his parting instructions to his son Solomon, who's going to take over the kingdom, parting words to his son Solomon on his deathbed. Now, don't forget, son, you've got this guy Shimei, he's still around, who called down bitter curses on me the day I was down, and I did not put him to death. but now, now do not consider him innocent. Son, bring his gray head down to the grave in blood. Can you imagine that? Like on your some of the last words you speak are venting rage and anger and bitterness that had been welling up and growing and multiplying for years upon years upon years. We say, well, Chris, why did David he handle the thing so well with Nabal but not with this Shimei guy? Well, like, what was the difference? I don't know. Other than to say David, as we have found out, was very human, just like we all are. And we're all going to struggle with these emotions, these feelings of so many more that we didn't even talk about. We're going to struggle with those our entire lives. And so again, the question is, do we allow them to dominate our lives? Do we allow them to dominate our thoughts? Do we allow them to so grab hold of us that is what we're thinking about in our last moments before we die and appear to God? We're still rehearsing bitter grudges from years and years and years ago. Say, no, that would never happen. Well, it will if we don't make a deliberate attempt to, like David did, at least initially release them to God. And so I just know, because I know myself, and I'm sure that I'm not alone in this. I know that there are probably several of you who need to release some stuff, need to let it go, need to let God take over. Doesn't mean that you're forgiving or it's not hurtful, whatever anybody said or did to you, but it just means that if you don't get off that road, you're gonna end up in a bad place. And God doesn't want that, and you don't want that, and you don't want to give that person the satisfaction of that. So I'm just saying, right, that you need to release it. And so we're gonna pray in a moment, and if this is you, like if there's something that you are angry about and you just need to give it to God. I'm not saying that you never try to deal with it with the person or whatever. Jesus talks a lot about that too. But if you are at the place where you are filled with anger and rage and you're just in danger of doing some things that you shouldn't do or saying some things that you shouldn't say, you need to get off that road. You need to exit that way.